Mr. David Lin, Chairman Maurice Chan, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to invite you to chair this first session on democratic governance. As we are all aware, we in Taiwan, ROC, are very proud of the complete political democratization we have achieved in recent decades. Perhaps it is not an overstatement to say that we have a vibrant democracy. In the course of our political transition, we have acquired most of the essential ingredients of modern democracy. They include the separation and control of power, the rule of law, respect for human rights, multi-political parties actively competing on political arena, free election at all levels of government, vibrant free media that would expose everything under the sun, and increasing government transparency and accountability, and above all, active participation by the civil society. In spite of all this achievement and progress, we feel that we are still miles away from achieving good democratic governance. For a young democracy like what we are, it is therefore imperative for us to think hard about how to achieve good democratic governance. I believe that the issue of democratic governance is highly complex. This is particularly so for all of us in a pluralistic society. For this session, we are very honored to have 5 distinguished scholars who will enlighten us on this important issue. Our first presenter is Professor Seung-Hip Kim of Department of Public Administration, Korea University of Korea. Our second presenter is Dr. Haruka Takenaka. Right. He's a professor of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Tokyo, Japan. Our third presenter is Dr. Yun-Han Zhu of Academia Sinica, and he's also the professor of National Taiwan University and concurrently president of the Jiangjin Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange. Our fourth presenter is Dr. Michael Ohanen, co-director, Center for 24th First Century Security and Intelligence, and director of Research Foreign Policy of the Brookings Institute. Our last presenter will also serve as a comprehensive discussion of this session is Dr. Yishan Wu, Distinguished Research Fellow and Director, Institute of Political Science, Academia Sinica, and Professor of Political Science at the National Taiwan University. Each of them will have 15 minutes for presentation, and Dr. Wu, as the comprehensive discussion, will have 20 minutes. After that, the floor will be open for general discussions. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this distinguished panelists. Thank you. May I call upon Professor Seung-Hip Kim to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Brookings and Taipei Forum and Association of Foreign Relations for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to visit another democracy, nation, rare democracy, vibrant democracy nation. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to structure my talk today divide my talk into three parts. The first part is about background, historical background, because Korean democracy, I've been supposed to talk about democratic governance in Korea. And Korean democracy should be contextualized in the historical trajectory of democratic transition and consolidation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the history. And then I'd like to talk more recent history in the sense that we have had so far 6 governments since democratization in 1987. So I'd like to highlight some of the features of those governments, particularly focused on state, civil society-state relations, because that's the key to understanding South Korean dynamics of South Korean politics recently. And lastly, I'd like to discuss some of the current issues, current tasks, and future challenges of South Korean democracy. So let me first talk about history. South Korea, I think, is a very interesting case among Asian cases of democratization. And sometimes it is compared very frequently with the Taiwanese case. And South Korean case is usually listed as one of the cases of mass ascendant or movement-driven democratization. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was this sharp contrast and active conflict between the developmental authoritarian state on the one hand and its state corporatist social groups and civil society groups, sometimes underground, sometimes outlawed, sometimes dissident, those civil society groups on the other. And the civil society groups was represented by the so-called triple solidarity of trade unions and student associations and religious groups. So there was this harsh conflict between the two throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. And the democratization, the transition we eventually had in 1987 was the climax of this clash, both physical and conceptual, clash between resistant civil society and very authoritarian state on the other hand. So, but I'd like to emphasize that while it was a mass ascendant and movement-driven and bottom-up transition as compared with some other earlier cases of democratization, it was at the same time a conservative democratization. It was not a revolution, it was not a massive uprising, but rather it was a conservative transition to democracy in the sense that after this climax of movement or mass mobilization in June of 1987, the actual evolution or the actual dealings of taking care of the transition was left to elite politicians. And civil society did not have that much role in this constitutional revision process and founding elections and the restructuring of the polity in the aftermath of the transition. So it was rebellious and transformative on the one hand, but also it was conservative at the same time. So we have this dual nature of South Korean democratization I'd like to emphasize. And we have had so far 6 governments and since 1987. The definition of the progressive and the conservative should be carefully redefined in the Korean context because the North Korean issue is one of the anchor key issues in defining what is conservative and what is progressive in the country. But nevertheless, roughly speaking, we had 2 progressive governments in the beginning and then 2 conservative governments in the beginning, in the immediate aftermath of the transition, and then 2 progressive governments afterwards, and 2 conservative governments again. And the current government, I would say, is a conservative government. So 6 consecutive governments so far. And if we look at this overall consolidational phase of South Korean democratization, we should be glad that there was no rupture, there was no reversal of the democratic order, as was the case with some other nation democracies, and there was no violence whatsoever in terms of this peaceful transition, peaceful transfer of power between conflicting political forces. But in terms of, if we look at analyze the civil society state relations in the post-transitional period, there is something very interesting here, because we see on the one hand a lot of developments in terms of the procedural democracy. So the institutions, all those essential institutions of democratic governance are there, like democratic institution, like elections, party reform, and empowerment of the legislature and the judiciary. And judiciary has become very powerful in South Korea. We even talk about judicialization of politics, because a lot of political issues have been handled and decided by the judiciary. And government innovation and administrative reform, including decentralization of local autonomy. So there have been a lot of procedural democratic development. On the other hand, however, in contrast, there were a lot of issues related with what is so-called the substantive democracy, related with the overall improvement of socioeconomic inequality, and this addressing the issue of socioeconomic polarization, and so on, has been slower as compared with this progress in procedural democracy. If I am to highlight some of the important developments in terms of civil society state relations over the past 6 governments, the initial Roh-Tae-woon government in the late 1980s and the early 1990s.
Interesting developments during that administration. Decorporatization of state corporatist groups, the formerly state corporatist groups that were pro-government groups in the 70s and 80s, they became rather independent of the state control. On the other hand, there were these people's movement groups which had been the spearheaders of democracy movement in the 70s and 80s, and they continued with their radical movement for democratization. And most interestingly, there were these new movement groups called citizens movement groups. They emerged anew in the aftermath of the democratization in 1987, and they focused on new issues like economic justice, environment, and gender equality, and consumer protection, and so on. And so there were these 3 groups and competing with each other and trying to influence the policy-making process. And in the later governments, like the Kim Il-sung government between 1993 and 1998, and the Kim Dae-jung government between 1998 and 2003, we see this slow rise of citizens movement groups, which became dominant and influential force in policy-making process in South Korea. That continued into the Roh Moo-hyun government between 2003 and 2008. And a lot of emphasis was put on participation, citizen participation, either as individuals or as groups participating in the policy-making process. But also another important tendency, another important phenomenon that happened during this period and over these 3 governments was that while there was this rise and increased influence of citizens movement groups, there was this division or fragmentation within civil society between conservative groups and progressive groups. So immediately after the democratization, there was this dominance of the so-called progressive groups, and South Korean people in general felt indebted for the sacrifice of the former democracy movement leaders, activists who were active in citizens movement sphere. But later, particularly during the Kim Dae-jung government, regarding this so-called engagement sunshine policy toward North Korea, there was big controversy in South Korea. And there were pro-sunshiners and anti-sunshiners, and there was a lot of controversy on that. And civil society was slowly fragmented into 2 different parts, progressive and conservative. And that continued, that has continued to today. So let me now shift to some current tasks and future challenges. I think that one of the biggest challenges South Korean democracy right now is confronted with is policy discontinuity. We have had these conservative governments and progressive government. Some of the policies, not only trivial policies, but also major policies have been shifting from one pole to the other. Policy discontinuity, and that also sometimes is accompanied by political instability. And so, I mean, this permanent politicization of public discourse and policy agenda sometimes leads to this phenomenon we might call permanent or constant lame duck kind of situation. So we have this 5-year presidential term, but as any president enters into the second year, and the lame duck stage sometimes begins, and because all the political issues have been politicized, over-politicized so much. So it is, in fact, it is very difficult to obtain a bipartisan or even a national consensus on all those political issues because the society, civil society, and the political circle in general are so much polarized between the conservative and political forces. And behind this is the existence of still underperforming political parties. I mean, political parties in South Korea, I mean, one evident example, one piece of evidence that South Korean political parties are still under-institutionalized is that they are changing their names so often. Even experts are very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult for the experts to follow all the names of those political parties. And not only the name changes, but sometimes it's very difficult to identify what kind of fundamental ideologies they are supporting and specific policy agenda or policy proposals they are supporting. And it's very difficult to identify the ideological characters of all those different political parties. And the political parties are very mistrusted and very low level of trust, public trust by ordinary citizens and voters. In the past, I mean, in the 1990s and in the, I think, during some of the previous governments, some of the functions that are supposed to be performed by political parties were instead performed by civil society groups. Civil society performed these very essential representative functions political parties couldn't perform. But today, because of this fragmentation of civil society itself, and mobilization of civil society, one segment of civil society and the counter-mobilization of the other segment of civil society and so on. What is important these days is that civil society itself is also less trusted as compared to the 1980s and the 1990s. And so both on civil society and political parties are less trusted by the public. And that leads to the overall crisis of the representative domain. And added to this is that a lot of civil society leaders, including, for example, the Seoul Metropolitan City Mayor, a lot of civil society, previous civil society leaders joined the political circle and became politicians themselves. And that led to this depopulation of civil society arena. And that also led to this decreased credibility of the civil society arena. So in that sense, we have this big crisis in the representational domain because both civil society and political parties, according to the view of the public, is not sufficiently performing their representative function. And the people sometimes have to resort to this direct action, like demonstrations and protests you frequently observe in the downtown streets of Seoul many times. In addition to this, I'd like to also point out some of the new things that should be taken into account when we assess the quality of democracy in South Korea, because there is this important generational change going on in South Korea. And there has been a lot of literature on what the younger generation, in the 20s and the 30s, what kind of ideological inclination they have. There is still controversy on that. But in my opinion, I mean, the younger generation tends to be a little bit more conservative as compared with those who are in their 40s, who led the democracy movement and who have been sympathetic to progressive governments. In addition to this generational change, also there has been a lot of discussion on the role of, on the impact of information communication technology, because these days a lot of demonstrations and protests in South Korea On the one hand, there is this difficulty of mobilizing more people because people are busy and people are less interested in politics and so on. But on the other hand, also, it becomes easier to mobilize young people because of this ICT development, as well as that young people tend to think that participating in protests, anti-government or political protests and demonstrations is not as costly as it was the case in the 1980s and 1970s, because you don't need to sacrifice your career, you don't need to sacrifice your life, and so on. And so these days, demonstrations and protest actions are sometimes combined with this sense of festivity. They are participating in protests, and they take the pictures and they upload that on the Facebook and so on. So a lot of things actually facilitate the participation of younger generation in protests and demonstrations also. And I'd like to close my talk by commenting on one of the currently evolving controversies in South Korea, because there is right now this important discussion on constitutional revision. South Korea, as some of you might know, is a 5-year presidential presidentialist system. And South Korea has never had a parliamentary system except for this 1 year, very brief period in the early 1960s. But right now, there is a discussion, including a possible transition to a parliamentary form of government, or a renewable term for the president, or some kind of Austrian or French type kind of cohabitation type kind of arrangement between the president and prime minister. Although the current president does not like the discussion very much, pointing to a lot of problems. But a lot of legislators in both the ruling party and the opposition party are interested in discussing this possibility of constitutional revision. And the current constitution was drafted in 1987. So there is this public support as well as the intellectual support for constitutional discussion. So that might be something to observe in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim, for such a comprehensive and penetrating analysis. In a way, it sounds very similar and familiar to us in Taiwan too. Thank you. Now may I call upon Professor Takanaka from Japan to make a presentation.
Thank you very much for introduction, and thank you very much. I'd like to thank Brookings Institution, the Taipei Forum Foundation, and the Association of Foreign Relations for having me here. And it's nice to be back to Taipei, and also to have a chance to show to express my gratitude to the people of Taiwan. This is because now almost 3 years have passed since the Great East earthquake had hit Japan. But we have received the Taiwan people really showing a lot of sympathy towards Japanese people, and have given us a lot of donations, which amounted to $2 million. That is probably every Taiwan person has made a donation of $300 Taiwan, and that's significant. And we, as a Japanese citizens, I was glad to have this chance to thank you. Thank you very much. And today, so I want to come back to the original topic, which is democratic governance of Japan. And today I would like to give a presentation on the state of democratic governance in Japan and its implication on policy formulation. And those who are familiar with those who are familiar with Japanese politics might be aware of a frequent time of prime ministers. since 2006, between 2006 and 2012, every year we have witnessed a change in Prime Minister. So we have six Prime Ministers between 2006 and 2012. And maybe it's hard to remember the name of political parties of Korea, but it is also hard to remember the name of our Prime Ministers, and especially for foreigners. And I think that really has undermined our leverage in foreign policy. And the question that this is really the answer, the key to answer why we had to see such a frequent turnover of prime ministers really lies in the configuration of our political institutions. And I raise this question: is Japan a parliamentary system? And according to textbook, it is yes. But in practice, it is almost no. Because in practice, Japan, to answer the question first, Japan is really a hybrid of parliamentary system with a separation of power system like US presidential system. And the key institution is our second chamber, which is very strong, independent from the cabinet, and the relationship between our cabinet and the House of Council is pretty much similar to the relationship between the president and the US president and the Congress, separation of power system. Okay. Now, according to textbook, Japan is parliamentary system because the lower houses chooses the prime minister and prime minister from the cabinet. The parliament can submit a vote of no confidence, and if the parliament, the Japanese diet passes the vote of no confidence, the prime minister has two options. The prime minister can resign or can dissolve the lower house. But the key is House of Councillors, and I explain that later. And before going over the issue of House of Councillors, I would like to give a brief overview of political changes since 1990s, because our political dynamics dramatically changed as a result of two major political reforms we have implemented in 1990s. In 1990s, we carried out two reforms. One is electoral reform, the other is administrative reform. And this really changed the political configurations within Japan and also policy formulation process. The first is electoral reform. That is, we changed our electoral system from SNTV system, single non-transferable system, to fast post system. And the second is administrative reform. We reorganized the structure of the government while increasing the legal power of prime minister. We increased the power of prime minister as well as the organization supporting the prime minister. And these two reforms had a deep impact on prime ministerial power. Basically, it enhanced prime minister's power. The change of electoral system from the SNTV system to the fast post system combined with proportional representation system. For those who may not be familiar with these jargons, the technical terms of political science, SNTV system under the former system, SNTV system, one district elected several politicians. Okay. So it was easy to get elected as an independent. And therefore, the ruling parties or all parties had to keep party discipline. Even those who do not obey the party executives and could not get endorsement in the elections had high chances of getting elected as independent. So the Prime Minister did not have so much leverage over to make the members of his party to follow his policy. In particular, when the policies became very controversial. But now, under the current system, the first past post system combined with the proportional representation system, the politicians have to the candidates have to have endorsement from the parties to get elected. And it has become very hard to get elected as independent. So that the most of the politicians have to follow the orders from the party executives. And in case of ruling parties, it is ultimately comes from the Prime Minister. And so the Prime Minister has easier time legislating controversial bills. And the other change, and the other reform, administrative reform also strengthens the Prime Minister's power. Before Japanese Prime Minister did not have so many resources to formulate policies on his own and to start policy initiatives. But now he has more organizations and resources, as well as he was given more power to initiate policies. And the second, the change in the Prime Minister's power was one of the major results of these two reforms. And the other change was the change in party system. Under the former SMTB system, it was easier for small and medium-sized parties to get elected, to elect their candidates as politicians. But now under the current system, more seats are allocated to the first past post system, so that small and medium-sized parties have to merge into a large political party. And so now we have a DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan, competing against LDP. Okay, although I have some Japanese specialists here, and they might wonder, there are small and medium-sized parties emerging still today. But I would say that probably DPJ will continue to last and will be reliable. And now, so these were two these were two major changes. And there was one powerful Prime Minister who took advantage of these two reforms. That was Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro. He served as Prime Minister between 2001 and 2006. He used the increased power of Prime Ministers to carry out series of reforms, including postal safety the reforms of the postal service system. And we, the political scientists, especially the young political scientists, thought, future Prime Ministers will continue to exercise strong leadership, and will probably continue to carry out reforms and improve Japanese economy, Japanese welfare system, and so we were glad that we implemented two reforms in 1990s. But our expectations was betrayed, and I was one of those eloquent scholar who was praising Prime Minister Koizumi for carrying out reforms, and also applauded the result of these reforms. And many of my colleagues said, after seeing frequent changes of prime ministers after Prime Minister Koizumi, many of my colleagues come up to me and, Takenaka-san, are you willing to change your mind? And why is your theory wrong? And so I thought, I had to find an answer. And I looked for an answer, and the key is really in the House of Councillors, and also the change of our party system. Okay. Now, even the Japanese do not take note of the second chamber. Okay. Our second chamber is probably the most powerful chamber next to the U.S. Senate in advanced in democracy, industrial democracies. Okay? It is according to the textbook, the lower house has superiority over the upper house, or the House of Councillors, because it can override the decision made by the lower house in legislation. Okay. But in practice, the House of Councillors has equal power vis-à-vis lower house as regard to legislations. This is because the conditions for override is so severe, and so it is really difficult to resort to the override. Okay? You need a 2/3 majority in the lower. If the upper house, if lower houses pass a bill, and the upper house, the House of Councillors, rejects this bill, the condition for override is 2/3 majority. If the lower house passes the same bill with 2/3 majority, then the bill becomes a law. Okay, that's first condition. And this condition is hard to meet because sometimes the ruling parties cannot have 2/3 majority in the lower house. We have about 65 years of democracy, but among these 65 years, about 7 to 8 years, it's only 7 or 8 years the ruling parties had a 2/3 majority in the lower house. And this Prime Minister Abe is lucky, now he has 2/3 majority. But even you have 2/3 majority, there's another obstacle. It is so technical, and even the Japanese did not know this constitutional article, this article in Constitution. We call them 6 days rule. And if lower house sends the bill to the upper house, and the upper house does not make decisions, the time that the lower house has to wait for 60 days to treat the bill as rejected by the upper house. Okay? And this 60 days rule really slows down the policy process, and sometimes puts the cabinet in a difficult position. For example, if you start a diet session in September, at the end of September, and the term of the session is going to end in, for example, at the beginning of December, sometimes this 60-day rule makes the cabinet very difficult position to legislate laws, because I'm sorry, this is getting very, very technical, but if, for example, if the diet session starts at the end of September, and the lower house spends a month to pass this bill, then the lower house passes this bill at the end of October, and if the diet session lasts until mid-December, then the opposition can just sit and wait for 6 days, because the time elapsed before the end of the mid-December. And so the cabinet cannot pass through the legislation, even it can resort to the override rule. I put this rather simply, and it's more complicated, but to save time, I think it was technical enough, but I think it's the legislation process gets get delayed in such a way. And so, when the opposition becomes a majority in the upper house, it becomes the cabinet faces serious problem, like U.S. president. U.S. as I think many of you are familiar with the U.S. politics, and if the Congress either the Congress or the Senate is shared by the opposition. Under the divided government, the U.S. president has always tough time passing through his policy agendas. And the same thing, the same situation takes place in Japan. We had a divided diet. We call them divided diet. When we have an American audience, we call them twisted diet for the British audience, because they call them twisted parliament. But here I use the word divided diet. And we have had divided diet most of the time between 2007 and 2012. And between 2007 and 2009, DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan, held almost a majority in the upper house. And what they did was they really opposed to most of the important bills offered by the ADP cabinets. Okay? And then between 2010 and 2012, now the DPJ came to power in 2009, and against the DPJ government, and after 2010 House of Councillors election, LDP became the majority with other parties in the House of Councillors. And the LDP was very angry because the DPJ obstructed everything they tried to do, so that LDP revenged against the DPJ and pretty much obstructed everything DPJ cabinet tried to do. And so that most of prime ministers were driven into political impasses and chose to resign. That was Prime Minister Fukuda was a good example, and also Prime Minister Khan was put into a political impasse because he could not pass through his legislation, and so he told to the LDP, I will resign, so in return for my resignation, please pass through these important pieces of legislation. Okay. Now, we have had divided diet in the past, but the political situation did not become that serious because the LDP was the only party which was dominant under the old electoral system. Okay, so under the old system, LDP was dominant and surrounded by small and medium-sized parties, and small and medium-sized political parties had no expectations to win the next general election, so that they chose to compromise and receive some policy concessions from the LDP using their leverage in the House of Councillors. Today, the political incentives work differently for party politicians, because it is now two major party systems. So if the leading opposition party obstructs the cabinet or the government policy formulation, then if the opposition party has high chances of winning the next general election. So this is what DPJ did between 2007 and 2009, and their tactics worked pretty well because they could win the 2009 general election. And in return, LDP obstructed everything and DPJ government tried to do between 2010 and 2012. And again, this strategy worked very well for the LDP because they could win the general elections in 2012. And so, now, just remaining time, I would like to give policy, just brief remarks on the implications of our policy formulation in security policies. And we had, because of the divided, to put it shortly, because of divided government, divided diet, and the policy formulation process in security areas was also retarded and became was slowed down. We had operations in Indian Ocean, assisting the U.S. Navy and the Navy of other countries engaged in war in Afghanistan. And that operation had to be suspended because the government could not renew legislation because it was under Fukuda cabinet, but Fukuda cabinet passed through the legislation that was necessary to continue the operation because it met opposition from the DPJ. That's number one. The second is the bill to combat the Somali pirates. The piracy in Somalia, off the coast of Somalia, became very serious towards the end of 2008. So the Prime Minister also decided to send Japanese self-defense force, the maritime Japanese self-defense force, off the to the Indian Ocean, again off the Somalia coast of Somalia. And at that time, you might be surprised, but Japan could only protect the Japanese ships. And we thought this would be unacceptable in the international community. So we submitted a bill so that the maritime self-defense force can protect ships of other countries. But the DPJ, for some reason, opposed to this bill, and it slowed down. So we could not start operations to help other to protect ships of other countries for about 3 months. Okay, in the end, the ASO cabinet could resort to the override. Okay, now just 15 seconds on the current political condition. Prime Minister Abe is very lucky because the LDP and the Komeito has a majority in both chambers. So he doesn't have to worry about getting his bills obstructed in the House of Councillors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are now called upon Professor Yun Tan-Ju to make his presentation. Thank you.
With your permission, I will walk down to the podium so that I can show the PowerPoint myself. I'm given a very challenging job, trying to analyze the situation of Taiwan's democratic governance within 15 minutes. It's such a huge topic. So I will simply concentrate on the more recent development and focusing on the Ma Ying-jeou's administration. And everyone remember that he was elected in year 2008 with almost a landslide, and also at the same time his party won a 3/4 majority in the LY, the legislative year. And 4 years later, he got re-elected. I would say also with a convincing victory, although the margin has shrunk a little bit. And also his party still managed to control, plus their ally of independent members, almost 2/3 majority in LY. So in theory, the KMT electoral landslide should have brought a conclusive end to the crippling experiences of divided government during Chen Shui-bian's 8-year presidency, under which he never really enjoyed a majority in the parliament. So he entered into constant battle of victory with the KMT dominating AOY. So a lot of observers had hoped, in the beginning of Ma's first term, that the conclusive victory in terms of both presidential race and parliamentary race will put the island back to the track of effective governance. But we have to say, in retrospect, especially since the beginning of the second term, this reasonable expectation has not been fulfilled. So this, I will use this following maybe 40 minutes, to try to explain why this has happened. A lot of the pundits try to offer their own explanation, and many of them point to President Mar's leadership style. Sometimes his decisiveness or his lack of skill to cut deals with friends and rival. But I would say this is only a very partial explanation for this overall sluggish performance. As a matter of fact, I will identify there are many what I call the intractable factors, structural factors, institutional and ideological, that are pretty much beyond the grip of any incumbent leader. And because of those intractable factors, I would even argue that our political system has been pretty much dead. To extend that, it's not simply up to the task of responding to the daunting international and domestic policy challenge the country faces. So I will, try to lay out those, the structural conditions which have hampered Taiwan's democratic political system. Before I go into the detail, but also I want to give President Ma some credit, especially the things that he has accomplished. Despite all the difficult conditions that he has been facing during his first term, I think he should be given due credit for number one, laying down a foundation for cross-strait peace by de-escalating the tension. Resuming the official dialogue in negotiation, normalize the cross-strait economic relationship, and concluding existing bilateral agreement, including ECFA, the hallmark of his first presidency. And also, he probably should be given credit for restoring trust and friendship with Taiwan's major allies, especially the United States. And also, I think he should be given credit for steering Taiwan's economy steadily through the world's global economic crisis, since the Great Depression, among other things. But however, one might also argue that while these accomplishments were enough to carry President Ma through his re-election bid in 2012, but they probably still fell short of what his campaign platform had promised, and probably trail far behind the high expectations of the great majority of Taiwan electorate. This is the reason why I argue that his accomplishment over the last 6 years probably is not nearly enough to adverse many of the worsening long-term socio-economic trends that threaten this island's future. Let me identify what are the most difficult obstacles to effective democratic governance on this island. Number one is unfavorable structural condition in terms of very unfavorable demographic, economic, and fiscal trend. I will elaborate on that a little bit later. And second category will be the poison social and political social. That includes the polarization of policy and politics between the so-called blue camp and green camp. And also, we have a very partisan, politicized, sensational, but also very fragmented, news media. And the third category of obstacle, actually I will spend more time later on this last one, is what I call institutional hurdle. That, especially in terms of legislative realignment and also having a very fragmented policy process. Now let me, identify a few very unfavorable long-term trends. One is, I think a lot of people sitting in this room are all familiar that, we are having a rapidly aging population. Taiwan will become what demographers will classify as an aged society, which means that people of the age of 65 plus, will constitute more than 14% of the population in 2017, and we will become, soon become a super age society, which means that more than 20% of the elder, constitute our population. That we're pretty much what Japan stands right now. And our reproduction rate has been very, very dramatically dropped, to 1%. I'm sorry, 1.0, not 1%. You need 2.0, reproduction rate to replenish, your, people who pass away. So I think this is, the very, unfavorable trend, and that really constrains the scope of, what policy can do to solve a lot of other public issues. And also, I think the island have to face up this, this trap of the low-cost manufacturer. Our export sector, we do have a very successful story, like the company led by Chairman Morgan Ken. But unfortunately, but also we have a lot of other companies in the high-tech sector, they continue to practice a cost-down strategy. And under that kind of business model, the lion's share of our export has suffered from the what we call the commoditization pressure, meaning the profit margin becomes thinner and thinner over time, and our company to compete, constantly with lower cost, lower wage countries entering this global supply chain. It also has a very detrimental effect on the income distribution on this island. It suppresses the wage level, especially the entry-level job. And also the business community, constantly pressures government to give them more tax holiday, more generous tax code for stock option or R&D write-off. And our tax code has been so skewed that really, they aggravated the income and wealth disparity, especially after 2009, when our core income tax has been slashed by 0.5% to only 17%, the lowest in the region. And also, when Ma was inaugurated, in 2008, he's facing with, a very worsening, physical condition. At this point, our government, at all levels, spend about 23% of GDP every year, but the tax revenue is below 12%. So the big shortfall, have to be made up, with increasing fee and fine, or selling of state-owned assets, or through borrowing. However, the borrowing capacity, of the central government has been, pretty much constrained. We are already reaching the ceiling, of the legal borrowing authority. When Manju, went off it, immediately faced this huge global downturn. So he had to introduce stimulus package that also, pretty much used up, the remaining borrowing capacity of the government. And also, I think, when he was inaugurated, he inherited quite a few what I call the hot potato issue, or you might even label it as time bomb. Okay. For instance, that the growing deficit of the universal health insurance, and also the Taiwan Power, our power company, suffered huge accumulated loss because the electricity rate was frozen for a long time, while import oil and gas keep rising into the price. And also we have a huge unfunded pension scheme for the public sector and military. So I would argue that President Ma is doomed to be a very unpopular president, but he had to deal with the complicated issue. And actually he also chose to postpone those difficult jobs until the beginning of most of those issues until the beginning of second term. And then he has to brought the bad news to many different constituencies to adjust the health insurance fee, pension scheme, and many other well-targeted measures. At the same time, I think the island for the last I would say 10 to 15 years has acquired a lot of element, for what political scientists label as governmental society. First is a total breakdown of trust and mutual respect between the two contending political parties. And secondly, our most print and electronic media are either blatantly partisan or excessive sensational. And we witness, especially with the emerging of social media, what we call the tribalism, in the cyberspace. Different group of people, they just attune to the like-minded, peers. Okay, so they are fed on with one-sided story. So the society actually, become also very fragmented, meaning that different people with different, source information tend to have a very different observation of the same event. So that really, also activates the polarization. And another important development, I would argue that the power in our political system nowadays is dispersed so wide. It has no center of gravity. Instead, the policymaking process is infested with veto players. And I will also elaborate on that a little bit more. Especially, I would like to focus on, this biggest challenge that the modern administration has been facing. That is legislative gridlock. And due to this gridlock, I would argue that the so-called unified government, meaning that the same party controls both the executive branch and the legislative branch, turn out to be largely an illusion. Because I would say for most part of his presidency, President Ma pretty much doesn't have really read on the legislative agenda at all, despite the fact that his party during his second term still controls almost two-thirds majority in the worldwide. Why this has happened? I will argue that the pendulum of political power has swung so decisively toward the LY, the legislative branch, over the last 15 years. And this, policy, power reconfiguration has enabled the speaker, the KMT LY caucus, and individual maverick LY members. Now, they are empowered to pigeonhole or tinker with all major legislative proposals proposed by the cabinet, almost at will. And also at the same time, DPP, even though it only has about 40 seats, out of 113, is also empowered to considerable bargaining power over the legislative agenda and to enjoy a lot of leeway exercising obstructive tactics to strangle the KMT government's major legislative initiative. And a very important component that contributes to this legislative gridlock is what I identify as probably the key to this to this phenomenon. That is the creation of the party caucus negotiation system. My good friend Dr. Suu Kyi, I believe that during his recent presentation at Brookings back in Washington, he characterized this system as the darkest aspect of our time. I hasten to point out that I fully agree with him. Since 1999, the Speaker and the DPP has successfully pushed forward this peculiar mechanism, the party caucus negotiation system. Any political party or coalition with 3 or more seats in LY can form a party caucus, and each party caucus can send 2 representatives to the closed-door negotiation meeting convened by the Speaker. And any party caucus can make a request to send any pending bill or amendment to this negotiation process and take them out of committee stage. And in most cases, I will argue that Speaker can jail the KMT caucus to seek compromise with the DPP caucus and other minority parties to avoid showdown on the floor. When I say showdown, it's normally not roll call, rather than sometimes involve fighting, only legislative floor, which is very unfortunate. And also, not only this enabled minority to obstruct this mechanism, but I think that over the last 10 years, the LY has invented a lot of conventions. These conventions, I think, strictly speaking, they are not constitutional. But nevertheless, they become a custom, a habit. But these conventions, over time, enable individual LY members to blackmail individuals. These measures include that the LY member can attach ridiculous number of free riders to the government budget bill, and those free rider amendments usually have nothing to do with budget. Okay, and hundreds of them each year, will rush through the budget review process. And also, the committee are given the power to introduce motion to impound a part of the budget, so that the minister has to come back to those members, who insist on this impoundment, for releasing those budgets, and that involves backdoor negotiation until their request or specific demand will be met. And also, the new convention also allows the LY Standing Committee to pass binding resolutions. Actually, constitutionally speaking, the committee doesn't have any authority to pass those binding resolutions. However, over time, the executive branch, however, they gave in, they acquiesced over, the binding authority of those resolutions. And I would argue that, over time, the executive branch simply becomes so timid and feeble to either draw the line or to rebalance, the legislative executive relationship, and they never, dare to bring those controversial measures to the constitutional court to verify whether they are, consistent with the constitutional design. So, but there are consequences. The consequences are argued that, due to the ascendance of legislative power, it fed on the individual lawmaker growing appetite for preparing their own legislative agenda and extorting various governmental agencies. It created fertile soil for the mushrooming of fat-paid political lobbyists and single-issue interest groups. So all interest groups, they know that it's probably not very useful to talk to individuals. Okay, but if you can get access to just a few, L1 members, you can actually, tinker or twist the legislative bill, very effectively. So in this case, I would argue that our political system has become infested with the veto player. That whoever with access to L1 can actually block, those provisions that they adamantly oppose. So there's, occasionally that maybe the LY can, I'll finish in less than 2 minutes. Are willing to adopt the legislative code from proposed by the cabinet, in fact. Usually, it will, be tinkered or substantially ordered, through this grinding machine. But not everyone has the access to the this court trading process taking place in the LY. I will argue that then many leaders of the social movement, NGO, they become very frustrated being locked out of this court trading process behind the door. So over time, they simply took their grievances. And the most explosive one took place, just in the early part of this year, known as the South Club movement. Although the factor contributed to this very disruptive movement, our motto. I don't have time to go into that, but nevertheless, I will, at the end of my talk, I will argue that, this fragmented political process has serious consequences for our future role in the region in terms of our external foreign economic policy. Up to this point, and I will bet, this problem, the challenge will continue even after 2016. The government was not able to foster a cohesive free trade coalition. No could claim the potential loser with material side payment or moral persuasion. Instead, the government has been vulnerable to various and often conflicting demands from all sorts of sector-based interest groups and their surrogate in their one. So at the end of the day, the government can only settle for what I call low-quality free trade agreement that cover only a very limited range of products and sectors. This approach is seeking the lowest common denominator, has so far allowed Taiwan to pick up the low-hanging fruit, such as ECFA and free trade agreement with Singapore and New Zealand. But I have to point out that this approach will certainly not get Taiwan through the much tougher negotiation on the TPP and RCEP. I end here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. And now may I call upon Dr. Ohan Rong to present.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. And I wanted to say that after hearing about all these problems, don't worry, now we're going to hear some good news from the world's largest and most powerful and oldest democracy. And that's meant to be a joke, in case you're clear. But actually, I'm struck. My good friend Richard Bush, and I'm very grateful to Richard for including me in this. Richard knows that part of my portfolio at Brookings is to look at troubled spots of the world. And I have to say, even though I understand and appreciate, and I've learned a lot about the problems of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan this morning, most of the parts of the world that I study would be very happy to have the problems of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So, as a word of introduction, I wanted to tip my cap, again, to all the wonderful things that have been happening in this region and continue to happen, despite the difficulties. What I want to do this morning in my brief remarks is to talk about the U.S. political system, but with a specific angle on the U.S. defense budget, which, of course, has particular interest in this region and elsewhere around the world. And so I'm not going to try to speak about everything in American politics, but I want to focus in on that. But let me begin with just a 2-minute summary of the framework and the constraints that have led us to where we are in the American defense budget debate today, because it requires a little broader perspective. But I'm going to go fast, and so please don't consider this a comprehensive assessment or critique or diagnosis of what's going on in American politics. But in a nutshell, as you know, Barack Obama was elected in 2008 for reasons that had to do partly with his own excellent speaking and vision, but also with the legacy of the Bush administration. And then, if there was any doubt about who would win the 2008 election, the financial crisis and the Great Recession began just before our elections. And so that's the context. Barack Obama then inherited a very bad economy. America spread its bad economy to much of the rest of the world. And I still feel, I know many Americans feel a guilt about that, because the Great Recession really was started in the United States, and we bear primary responsibility for it. And as a result, Barack Obama presided over 4 straight years of federal budget deficits exceeding $1 trillion American dollars, which is a remarkably bad situation. And in some sense, President Obama, instead of scaling back his ambitions, decided that he had to do things like healthcare reform and financial reform because he saw no other long-term way to handle our economic woes. And so, unfortunately for him, this created, in part, a backlash, because it allowed Republicans to portray him as a big spending Democrat, which is their preference in how they, so both parties have their specific political critiques they like to fall back on. Republicans enjoy portraying Democrats as tax and spend liberals. And because of the conditions that Barack Obama inherited, but also because of his legislative agenda, which was very ambitious, Obama played into this caricature to some extent, which then gave rise to the Tea Party movement, which won a great deal of congressional power in 2010, just 2 years after Obama had been elected himself. And that launched a period of financial and fiscal austerity debate in the United States, which produced, among other things, deep cuts in defense spending under the Budget Control Act of 2011. Defense spending was not the only thing that was affected. Domestic investments in education, infrastructure, science, and so forth were also affected. For the most part, entitlements and taxes were not affected, however, which is part of the frustration for many of us watching this process, because in a sense, the 2011 Budget Control Act cut those instruments of U.S. federal spending that have to do with promoting American power and long-term strength. Defense spending, scientific research, education, infrastructure. You could argue these are the most important things to protect, but they were the first things that were cut. And since that time, we've been trying to wrestle back towards some kind of a greater sense of sanity in how we make budgets, because in addition to the immediate cuts that were made under the Budget Control Act, as you're aware, the Congress and the President created this concept of sequestration, which meant additional automatic cuts, again, to the instruments of national power that I mentioned earlier: defense, science, education, infrastructure, and not to entitlements, and not to taxes. No change to tax code either. But sequestration would have additional effects, and it would do so in a fairly arbitrary and almost apocalyptic way, or certainly a very unfortunate and mindless way of cutting a little bit or a moderate amount from a lot of different accounts. The idea behind sequestration is it was so bad of an idea, everyone assumed that it would not actually happen, that Congress and the President would find a way around it. They would pass a new law that would create comparable amounts of deficit reduction without this mindless act on the instruments of national power. But unfortunately, that did not happen. In my quick summary of American politics, the next big thing that happened was the 2012 re-election of Barack Obama. And one of the things he said quite a bit during that election was that he wanted to end 2 wars on his watch. And as you know, Obama campaigned to some extent as a pro-peace politician, a left-of-center Democrat. He somehow took the nomination away from Hillary Clinton when most people assumed that she would win the nomination. Part of how he did that was his pure opposition to the Iraq War. So he wanted to be a peace president, and yet early on in his first term, he actually made decisions to triple American combat forces in Afghanistan, and he increased the pace of drone strikes around the world several-fold over George Bush. So in fact, he was not a peace president in his first term, but he still wanted to capture that rhetoric. And so by the time he was running for re-election, as you know, he had previously announced the policy of the rebalance or the pivot to Asia. But that policy is subtle enough and flexible enough that Obama did not have to portray it as a big, hawkish, pro-defense sort of agenda. And instead, when he ran for re-election in 2012, he talked about ending 2 wars on his watch. Well, where are we today? It looks like the war that he thought he had ended has come back. That's Iraq and now Syria, with an American role. And we still try to use rhetoric in the United States that we're not involved in combat. But come on, we're dropping bombs every day. So most countries would acknowledge this to be a combat war. So we're trying to prevent any big return to a major boots-on-the-ground role. But we do have almost 2,000 personnel in Iraq today. Those are boots on the ground. And it's a substantial advisory capacity, if nothing else. And now, of course, President Obama has announced that by the end of 2016, he will withdraw all U.S. combat forces from Afghanistan, which I personally think is a big mistake, because I think we still need to have the ability to launch commando raids and drone strikes in Pakistan and elsewhere in the region against Al-Qaeda targets if they develop again. But be aware, the President always is talking about ending the war in Afghanistan, but he never actually quite does it. And he will be the first president in American history to have spent 8 years in the White House involved in a war in one single place the entire 8 years, Afghanistan. So he's been talking about ending it, and yet he's about to set a record for the longest single American military role in any one presidency in U.S. history. No other American president ever presided over 8 years of combat in the same theater. So he is, in theory, ending the war, but in practice, he's fighting the war. And we'll see exactly where he winds up. The reason I spent a couple of minutes on this history, with now an eye towards the defense budget, is to, and I want to be done within 5 minutes to give my good friend enough time to comment and make some sense of all the things he's heard together. But the reason I give you this sort of interpretive history is to create a sense of tension in what I'm going to say now about the defense budget. There is no simple way to portray the U.S. defense budget. Sometimes we use rhetoric of ending wars, sometimes we use rhetoric of rebalancing, sometimes we are sequestering the defense budget. And by the way, everybody here, you speak excellent English. Don't feel bad if you don't understand the word sequester. We are using this word. It's not really a normal use of the word. So if you're wondering, what does this term mean? I thought I had studied English better than that. Don't worry, it's a bizarre term, and it's meant to be a bizarre idea and a bizarre practice that we were never supposed to be doing in the first place. And now it's haunting us again, because it's supposed to come back on October 1st next year if we don't find some new legislative vehicle to get around it. Okay, so there's a little bit of contradiction in the world's largest and oldest, not largest, but oldest and in some ways most powerful democracy as we talk about defense. Just a couple of facts and figures, and then maybe I'll conclude. We still spend $600 billion a year on our military. $600 billion American dollars. That is still well over our Cold War average when you adjust for inflation. When you adjust for inflation, we spent almost $500 billion a year during the Cold War. Today, we are still spending $600 billion. So reports of America's military demise are slightly exaggerated and slightly premature. In addition, that $600 billion still accounts for 40% of the world's total spending on military forces. And when you add in our allies and security partners, like the countries and great impressive friends in East Asia represented with me on this panel today, as well as NATO, our Middle Eastern partners, our Latin American partners under the Rio Pact. We, Americans, are very blessed. We are part of a broad coalition of more than 60 states, and the combined military spending of those 60 states is more than 70% of the world's total. So this is remarkable in world history to see so much military excellence and power under one very vaguely and loosely defined coalition. And of course, part of why it's successful is it is a loose coalition. We don't always all agree on everything all the time. We don't always do everything together all the time. If the Japanese only want to protect their own ships for a while, we have to live with that. If we have other issues where we disagree with a certain ally, the Germans don't want to be part of the Iraq invasion, what have you, we have to live with that. That's okay. That's why the coalition works. That's one of its great strengths. So U.S. military spending is still quite high. It's still 3.5%, 3.6% of GDP. There's no country in this region that reaches that threshold except North Korea. They're slightly above 3.5% last I checked, but we're still at 3.5%. Now we are headed down, and if sequestration returns, we will be down to about $500 billion or a little more. But you shouldn't worry too much about that. You should worry a little. You shouldn't worry too much, because we still have what's called the Overseas Contingency Operations Account, which is a supplemental, an additional budget for war spending. And we are using that budget somewhat literally to compensate for the rapid decline in our base budget, in our core regular defense budget. And I would expect that with all the crises of 2014 around the world, that will continue. In other words, we put a little more money in that supplemental budget than we really need for the immediate operations in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere, we actually partly compensate for the fact that we're cutting the rest of the defense budget a little too fast. And by the year 2016, and I'll finish on this note, by the year 2016, we will have, as will you, Taiwan friends, a presidential race. And it's very hard to forecast exactly who will win the Republican nomination in particular. It's probably not even safe to forecast who will win the Democratic nomination. But I will hazard the following prediction. Both candidates will be pro-defense and will be in favor of a strong American role in the world. Partly because 2014 has been such an ugly year for the world. And 2014 has reminded Americans that as much as we sometimes get tired of global leadership, when we get tired, things seem to go a little worse in the world sometimes. It doesn't mean we always do the right thing. It doesn't mean American military power is always the solution, and I certainly don't think it is. But right now there seems to be a bit of a correlation between an American president who's trying to end wars and cut defense spending and a world that's getting more dangerous. And I would predict that both candidates for the presidency that emerged from our primary process in 2016 will want to restore at least very modest growth in the U.S. defense budget. For example, enough to get our Navy back on a slightly upward growth trajectory. Because as you know, we're trying to increase naval strength in the Asia Pacific. We want to have 60% of the Navy in this general region by 2020. But if we cut the Navy at the same time that we're increasing the percentage in the Asia Pacific, it doesn't really make any net positive difference. So at a minimum, we need to preserve, roughly, the size of the Navy. We need to avoid cutting the Army so fast that it can't handle two crises at once. And there are a few other practical considerations like that, which I believe will tend to push the U.S. defense budget in a slightly more hawkish direction by 2016. So I'm not predicting any radical change, but I would also remind you that sometimes, even though it's ugly on my side of the Pacific and we're not making policy in a very impressive way, the net effect on the defense budget really has not been so terrible, and I think will probably remain a very dependable friend of countries in this region as we attempt to carry out the rebalance strategy and also prevent the Middle East from totally blowing up. Thank you for your time. Best wishes.
Thank you, Dr. Oharon, for this very stimulating analysis. Now may I call upon Dr. Wu to make comprehensive comments.
Thank you, Chair. It's really my great pleasure to be able to come here and to comment on the four excellent presentations, which I didn't know a word about before I heard them minutes ago. So it's to spend 50 minutes to talk about the challenges of Taiwan politics is a daunting job, and what I'm going to do probably is more so. I would like to combine, if I can, the three presentations into a framework. Namely, I think what we are talking about is the challenges to democratic governance, not only in old democracies as in the United States and Japan, but also in new democracies, as we are seeing in South Korea and Taiwan. Those challenges, as far as I can see, comes from the domestic realm, and it primarily has to do with the polarization of the society as a result of increasingly more unequal distribution of wealth. That is the greatest challenge. And that is combined with very serious daunting challenge from abroad. In the case of Taiwan, how to deal with a rising China. In the case of Japan, increasingly how to deal with a rising China. in the case of South Korea, always how to deal with a precarious, unpredictable North Korea. And in the case of the United States, Korea, China, ISIS, you name it. So we have all those challenges, and those challenges are not decreasing, they are increasing. And those challenges are now greatly enhanced by the social media, because the social media is providing the instrument with which social protests can, the protest groups can dramatically reduce the costs of collective actions. So if you have those people who do not agree with the government, then it's much easier for them to join their forces, to put great pressure on the establishment for the government to either change the course or to abandon the policy altogether. So you have domestic challenge, you have external challenge, and you have the enhancement effect of new social media. All this will fall on the institutions of democracy. As far as I can see, in all the three Asian countries, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, those countries have changed their political system to make it more majoritarian, by which I mean it's the political, the division of political force in the establishment will not be proportionate to the social forces. So that if you are a majority party, if you are a big party, then you tend to gain disproportionately greater voice in the policy-making process. This is majoritarianism. Majoritarianism is good in the sense that it tends to produce very clear majorities, so we know who the leader is. But it is bad in the sense that it's not fully reflecting the social mood, the opposition, especially the small political parties, social actors, and civil organizations, and so on and so forth. So we have all those daunting challenges, and they all fall on a majoritarian political system. What is going to happen with these combinations? The social forces, the social opposition, will find themselves difficult to be channeled into the establishment. And as a result, they tend to erupt outside the establishment. There will be a lot of direct actions. There will be Occupy movement. There will be, probably not everyone is trying to follow the example of Taiwan, but in any case, we just had 3 weeks of occupation of our parliament, which was unimaginable and unprecedented. So these are daunting challenges to the democratic system. So let me talk a little bit about the details in these different aspects. First one, I'd like to emphasize that domestic challenge is present in all the 4 countries, and they have probably a common cause. And the common cause being that of the adoption of neoliberal economic policies. Ever since the 1970s, especially the 1980s, the whole world has tilted towards economic left. It's more pro-libertarian, in economic terms. We have more and more based on the market, and we become increasingly distrustful of anything that the state might do to intervene into the market. And so, marketization, privatization, they become vogue. And started in the United States under Ronald Reagan and United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. This thought began to occupy the policy agenda of the major Western countries. And lo and behold, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the whole Eastern Bloc added to the strength of this neoliberal economic policy. Now, neoliberal economic policy has this advantage of unleashing market forces and generating creativity, productivity, and so on and so forth, but also tend to increase the income gap in any given society that has adopted neoliberal policies. And that tends to polarize the society, and that polarization finds its way into politics. So in all those countries, we are seeing, for example, an increase of its Gini coefficient, its Oshima index becomes worse, the rich become richer, poor poorer, the college students would have to borrow a lot in order to finish their courses and get their degree, but then they are heavily in debt, and so on and so forth. I mean, it would be unimaginable that this social rule will not find its way into the political institutions. So you are seeing all this, and it is very evident in Taiwan. In the past, we had very high economic growth rate, but that gradually slowed down. In the 1980s, in some years of the 1980s, we even had double-digit growth. It slowed down to like 7% in the 1990s, 5%, and then 4% probably in the early 2000s, and then lower than that, 3%, 2%. But at the same time, the distribution of income has become uneven. So you combine these two, obviously there will be political pressure on the system. And I would argue that it's the same case in the United States, in South Korea, and Japan as a global trend. Now, that is polarization, but then it seems that market can generate sufficient creativity and productivity to offset the effect of polarization. But, lo and behold, we have the financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9. And so we had not only polarization, but then stagnation of the economy. So we are putting these two gravest economic evils together. And so that would create explosive social conditions. That's why in the United States we have people talking about 1% versus 99%, the Occupy movement, and it got spread around. It went spiral. So that's the domestic scene. External scene. In the case of Taiwan, and in terms of external scene, a lot has to do with the rise of China, the recovery of Russia, the strategy taken by the United States to try to contain those forces, and the very troubling effect, the situation that you have not only those strategic challenges, but then also the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. So I think the United States in the 1990s, that was a golden period for the U.S. Productivity was rising, and the Soviet Union just collapsed, and China became stronger, but not to the point of really challenging the U.S. and Germany. There was some skirmishes between rising China and the U.S. as in 1992, 1995. We saw scale, but nevertheless, that was a manageable decade. But then in the 2000s, because of the 9/11, the U.S. would have to determine just which is the graver enemy, whether fundamental Islamic fundamentalism or the strategic challenge from China. And I think the U.S. decided that it should go for the more direct challenge, and so it went into Iraq, Afghanistan, and towards the 2000s, you are finding that China has become too powerful to be left alone. So there's a pivot to Asia and so on and so forth. Now with China, rising China, Taiwan is feeling this external challenge. How is it going to deal with it? And that defines Taiwan's politics. Whether you are pro-green or pro-blue, it's not determined by whether you are a socialist or a capitalist. In Taiwan, basically everyone is a capitalist. But depending on whether you would like to take a more pro-American very weary about a rising China attitude, or you take China as both a challenge but also as opportunity, so you would like to engage China economically. So that defines Taiwan's politics. And in the case of South Korea, the progressive and the conservative forces, they obviously are not divided over China, but over how to deal with North Korea. In the case of Japan, how to deal with China, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's increasingly becoming a powerful definer of Japanese politics too. And in the case of the United States, it's basically still left and right, but also taking into consideration rising challenges. So what I'm suggesting is that when you have a rising China, you have recovery of the Soviet Union, you have ISIS and so on and so forth, the world has become less and less safe. And those countries are defining their politics in terms of the strategies to deal with those external challenges. So domestically, you have polarization of the society and economic problems. And externally, you have the shift of international forces and the debate on what is the best challenge, best strategy to deal with it. These are the challenges that all those democracies are facing. And they have the institutions, which I would describe as on the majoritarian side, to deal with them. In South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, they all shifted in their electoral systems away from the SNTV system to NMN. And NMN is more majoritarian, SNTV more proportional. And as a result, today we are seeing in Taiwan the KMT controlling both the presidency and the legislative branch. And in Japan, we are seeing Shinzo Abe in full control of the Diet. The reason for the ruling party to be able to have this dominant position has a lot to do with the electoral system, which gives them the weight that actually they don't have in a society. So when that happens, and you have very serious challenge, right? And those challenges would give rise to very serious debate as to what is the best strategy. And the government would take only one strategy. And many people would object to that, and they would take different strategies, but their voices probably cannot be sufficiently heard in this majoritarian democratic framework. And so, lo and behold, we are seeing a lot of social actions, direct social actions in Taiwan, in South Korea, and probably you are going to see more in Japan, or even in the United States. So that's the daunting task. How are we going to deal with greater challenges domestically and internationally with a political system that may not be able to take into considerations a lot of voices in the society? I don't have a clear answer. This has to be answered and solved by the different democratic democracies that we mentioned. But I do think that even with that, all the institutions, democratic institutions, have shown great resilience against radicalization of their politics. So things are still basically run within the democratic channels. Democracy is still the only game in town. And so I congratulate on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. I think we are running behind schedule, so I'm afraid that there will not be time for Q&A or general discussion. Perhaps we should leave it to our luncheon and afternoon discussion. But let me say that this is a very interesting and stimulating session. This is the first time I ever heard so many experts who very candidly analyze all the problem of democratic governance in our four countries. And I would say, as I said in the very beginning, democratic governance is such a complex issue that is closely conditioned both by domestic and external environments. In the era of globalization, it's become much more difficult to manage and to achieve. Secondly, for our in Taiwan, I think a lot of our problem is more of structural in nature, and we need to continue reform, particularly in our systems and mindset. But let me say that this is, once again, this is a very, very fruitful session, and we think we all learned a lot from the 5 presenters. I will ask you to join me in giving applause to our distinguished panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now our time for luncheon. Please refer to the back of your badge